welcome you to the Democracy for America Illinois Democratic Attorney General's Forum. So thank you all for coming. We are happy to have you here. Now, first thing I want to make sure I thank CAN TV, who's going to be covering this event live for us today. And if you know anyone who couldn't make it, they wanted to see the event, let them know that they can watch it right now on cable channel 27 or watch it online at cantv.org. Also, it is being streamed live by our friends at Hard Lens Media. So you go on Facebook, type in Hard Lens Media, and you can also view it live as we speak. So please let your friends know that they can join us if they're not here in person. Now, one of the things I want to make sure to do is let you know about our moderator. Our moderator today is Amara C. Enya. She attended University of Illinois Champaign, where she majored in broadcast journalism and was editor of school newspaper. She has a PhD in educational policy and graduated from UI Champaign's College of Law. Amara speaks 5 languages. She's a community activist, an organizer, a lawyer, PhD, Ironman enthusiast, a polyglot and passion for public policy. So, ladies and gentlemen, please give a warm round of applause for our moderator, Dr. Mara Enya. So our first candidate is State Representative Scott Drury. Next up will be Sharon Fairley. She's a former Chicago Independent Police Authority Review Chair. Mr. Aaron Goldstein, who's Chicago Democratic Ward Committeeman. And Mr. Renato Mariatti. I think I said that correctly, sir. All right, attorney. State Senator Kwame Raoul. Highland Park Mayor Nancy Rodering. And Chicago Park District Board President Jesse Ruiz. And former Governor Pat Quinn. So I think you've all seen the program, so the rules are pretty simple. Due to time constraints, there will be no opening or closing statements by the candidates. Each candidate gets 1 minute to answer the question that is asked of them. Not all questions will go to all candidates due to time constraints, and the moderator will decide which candidates should respond to which questions. Candidates are allowed an additional 30 seconds for rebuttal if they are directly mentioned during another candidate's response to clarify their position. There will be no back and forth amongst the candidates. And for the audience, please hold your reactions to the end. No booing, no clapping, no cheering, all of that stuff, in order to keep this forum lively and engaging for all. So thank you all, and I turn it over to our moderator, Mara Enya.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here for this debate. We are very excited to have all of these candidates represented here, and we hope that you get as much out of it as we got even in organizing this debate, or this forum, rather. So just to reiterate a couple of things that Tim said, in the spirit of transparency, because we have many candidates, we wanted to find out what issues were relevant to them, or the issues that they wanted to be able to speak on, and that's how we determined who would get to speak to particular questions. We understand that with 8 candidates, it can become quite long if they all respond to every question. So we were considering just the flow of this forum as we thought about the questions that we were going to ask. Again, just to reiterate, we do have a timer, and this is for the candidates as well. Kevin is down at the front, and can you give them the signal that you will give them as their time is running out? I will do that. Um, but because we have so many candidates, we want to be respectful of everyone's time and ability to respond to the questions. So with that said, we will get right into it. The first question actually is going to be the only one where all of the candidates will get a chance to respond. And actually, I want to add that there are a few yes or no, very quick hit questions to which we'll just be asking you to either raise your hand or to answer yes or no. So that will be interspersed throughout the forum. But the first question is really just for the sake of our audience. And we'll start with Governor Quinn at the far end, and then we'll just work our way down in order. And the question is about your background and preparedness and the reason why you are seeking the position of Attorney General for the state of Illinois.
Well, I believe the Attorney General should be a lawyer for the people of our state, and if you're a lawyer for the people, you've got to know the people. And I've been a public interest lawyer since 1980. I've represented clients before the Illinois Commerce Commission, before administrative agencies, before courts, both circuit, appellate, Supreme Court in Illinois, all on public interest cases involving fair utility rates, fair property tax assessments, making sure that voter rights are protected. I think it's very important to have a strong voice for everyday people as the Attorney General, someone who can stand up to President Trump when he violates the law and does unconstitutional things. The last line of defense for our democracy in our country are state attorneys general. And over again, we've got to sue the federal government to protect our environment, to protect our consumer rights, to make sure that the Affordable Care Act is carried out and not damaged. I signed the bill to establish that in our state of Illinois. I think these fundamental rights of everyday people are the job of the Attorney General.
Well, I understand the plight of working class families in Illinois. Came here as, my father came here as a migrant farm worker with a third grade education, and I benefited from the American dream. And that American dream is under attack. And I want to be the middle class's champion, their lawyer, to defend their rights. Either that attack comes from our very own president or from corporations who would try to take advantage of students with unscrupulous student loans, whether it be corporations and others who would harm our environment and put our water and our air and our land at risk, or whether it be from our own public officials who are not giving us the open, honest, and transparent government we deserve. And from bringing about criminal justice reform. I was involved in bringing community policing to Chicago back 25 years ago. You can find the news clip of me on Channel 9 calling for this with the Allison Payne when I was just in my 20s. So I've been answering the call to public service my entire life, even when I wasn't pointing to anything that was just a private citizen. I look forward to doing that as your Attorney General.
We're having conversations right now that we never dreamed of 2 years ago. And we're discussing human rights, we're discussing civil rights. I'm currently a mayor, but I come to this job as a grassroots organizer, someone who's been an advocate my entire life. And so you can tell what someone's going to do by what they've already achieved. I, as a mayor, have stood up to the NRA and fought them all the way to the United States Supreme Court by banning assault weapons and large capacity magazines, and we prevailed. I've stood up to large utilities and gotten tens of millions of dollars invested in our infrastructure. And I've created a legal aid clinic to help our immigrants, people dealing with domestic violence, people dealing with bad landlords. If you're going to lose your house, if you're going to lose your family, if you're going to lose your life, you need an advocate. I've been that advocate for decades. I'm Nancy Rodering. I'd love your support. Thank you.
I actually agree with Nancy. What you've done reflects upon what you will do. I've been serving as an attorney for going on 25 years and as an advocate in the legislature for 13 years. I've worked on law enforcement reform prior to the time it became popular, prior to the revelation of a Laquan McDonald video. I passed a bill creating the Torture Inquiry Commission because of what we knew what was going on in the Chicago Police Department. I passed comprehensive law reform the year before the revelation of a Laquan McDonald video. I abolished the death penalty in Illinois because we were second only to the state of Florida in a number of innocent men we sent to death row. I passed the bill to allow us to take full advantage of the Affordable Care Act. As a cancer survivor, that's important to me. I think I've benefited by the access to insurance, and all people shall. I will take that same history of doing to the Attorney General's office.
Hi, I'm Renato Mariotti, and my history is different than these people up here. I'm not going to talk to you about bills that I've passed because I'm not a politician. I've never had a job in Springfield. Unlike everyone else up here, I'm not a politician, and I'm not somebody who's been appointed by Rom to anything. I am somebody who grew up in Chicago and then in the suburbs to two parents who both worked two jobs because they hadn't gone to college and they had to work their butts off just to make ends meet. And I was a federal prosecutor for 10 years, and I did not expect, I will tell you this, I did not expect to be up here running for office a year and a half ago, but I decided to do this and became a kind of a resistance activist after I left the U.S. Attorney's Office because there are too many big problems in our country. And it's not just what Donald Trump is doing, but it is the rich and powerful people like the folks that I was investigating, the white-collar criminals as a federal prosecutor, who are taking advantage of the system now. And that is something the Attorney General can do a lot about, going after people who are taking advantage of the system on your behalf. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Aaron Goldstein. I'm running for Attorney General. Can you believe that? I am running for Attorney General to propose a bold, progressive agenda, one that stands up to the entrenched interests. That's the big corporations, the big banks, and Donald Trump. So when the corporations are taking advantage of us and polluting our water and continuing climate change, I will stand up to them. Number two, for real criminal justice reform. That means ending this racist drug war, ending mass incarceration, and stopping cash bail. Finally, we also need real police reform. And what I've been proposing is that the actual community have the voice in that real police reform. I see a sign there, that might be 10 seconds. But also to stand up against corruption. I stood up when Bernie Sanders ran for president and he said we need a political revolution. I propose a revolution in the courts. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Sharon Fairley, and I also am a candidate for the office of Illinois Attorney General. I entered this race because I believe that the people of Illinois are tired of the racist and regressive policies by the Trump administration and his vicious attacks on our civil rights and well-being. People of Illinois are tired of our ever more entrenched political leaders who are failing to address the serious challenges we face and leave our state in a constant political quagmire. People of Illinois are tired of our political leaders helping line the pockets of the corporate and special interests while failing to deliver economic prosperity and educational equality to our communities. We need a different kind of leadership. Rather than the usual suspects, the career politicians, some of which who are on the stage before you today, we need a different kind of leadership here in Illinois. I will bring experienced, principled, and independent leadership. Everything I've done in my life, personally and professionally, has prepared me for this role. I was born in the Jim Crow era. I was a young girl in the civil rights era of the 60s. I was a teenager during the women's lib movement. I have been marginalized and fought for myself my whole life and my career. My goal is to fight for you, the citizens of Illinois, just like I've done my whole life. That's why I'm running for office, and I hope that you'll support me.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Scott Drury, and I'm running for Attorney General to clean up Illinois. I'm a former federal prosecutor. I'm an adjunct professor of law at Northwestern University. I'm a member of the Northern District of Illinois' trial bar. I'm also a state representative and the only Democrat in the last 3 decades to vote no or to vote against Mike Madigan becoming the Speaker of the House, because we know in this state if we are going to be progressive, that we can't just blame it on the other side. We have to look at the fact of why we have Governor Rauner in office, why Donald Trump is in office, and sometimes we have to look inward, and there are changes we need to make to our own party in order to progress the priorities that we have. On day one, when I take office, we are going to transform the Attorney General's office into a corruption-fighting machine. We are no longer going to outsource that responsibility to the federal government, to the Better Government Administration, and to the newspapers. We are going to impact criminal justice reform in a real way. I'm running for Attorney General to be a hands-on Attorney General, not a figurehead who takes orders from machine politicians. I'm going to take my orders from you, and every day of our lives, we are going to make the Attorney General's office an office that acts on your behalf. Thank you so much. I'm Scott Drury. I'm running for Attorney General.
Thank you to all of you for those opening remarks. We're going to start with one of the most pressing topics here in the state of Illinois, and that deals with this issue of criminal justice reform. There are two questions that I'll ask, and the first question will be directed to Mr. Ruiz, Mr. Goldstein, Mrs. Fairley, and Mr. Jury. And then the second question will be directed to the remainder of the candidates. So the first question: in 2015, Governor Bruce Rauner assembled a commission of elected officials, experts, attorneys, and other leaders to address criminal justice reform in Illinois. 25 recommendations were made from that commission. However, only 4 of those recommendations have been implemented. As Attorney General, what is your top criminal justice reform issue that you would champion for the state? Again, we'll start with Mr. Ruiz, then we'll go to Mr. Goldstein, Mrs. Fairley, and Mr. Jury.
As I mentioned in my opening comments, I was involved with the Community Alliance for Neighborhood Safety back in 1992 to bring community policing to Chicago. My first visit to Manhattan was in the back seat of a squad car doing ride-alongs to see how they had implemented it. And CAPS is not that system. We need to make sure that we reform, and we have the opportunity through the lawsuit that the Attorney General has brought against the City of Chicago and the Chicago Police Department. It's one that, frankly, the Sessions Justice Department should have brought but did not. Thank goodness the Attorney General of Illinois picked up the baton. And through that, we were going to have a consent decree. And that consent decree will have a number of opportunities to make sure that we change the culture of the Chicago Police Department and make sure that the officers who are there to serve and protect are supported, but that we rebuild the trust, that they get the training. They should have continual professional education, just like lawyers have and other professions have. And then we also have to make sure that the crimes that we're going after in terms of bail reform and what we're prosecuting in the state are not, frankly, discriminatory, which they are. We continue to fill our prisons with young minority men. So those are some of the issues, and there's more that I'd love to talk to you all about further with more time.
Thank you. Mr. Goldstein.
So I've spent my entire career representing actual human beings. I'm not a corporate attorney. I'm not a prosecutor. I sit next to and stand next to poor people every single day who are the victims of this criminal justice system. So what do we need to do? And I mentioned it in my opening. Number one, we need to end this racist drug war. The first step of that is legalize marijuana. I will be a staunch advocate to legalize marijuana. That has to happen. Number two, we need to end mass incarceration. Well, we can end mass incarceration by starting to decriminalize the rest of the drugs. People should not be in prison because they're addicted. It's absolutely ridiculous, and we will see, whether it's today, tomorrow, or the next generation, we will see that this policy is one of the worst domestic policies we've had in the last 50 years. Finally, we need to end cash bail. Someone should not be in jail because they can't post $100 or $200. That is an absolute travesty and discriminatory.
Thank you. Mrs. Fairley.
So as a federal prosecutor, I had pretty much a front row seat to the criminal justice system and had a really good view of where it works and where it doesn't. And ladies and gentlemen, we have a lot of work to do. Let me tell you where I'll first start. So I have spent a couple of years working on police accountability and police reform. And the relationship between law enforcement and our communities is essential to public safety. And so that's an area that I think we really need to focus on, and the office should spend more time, work, and energy focusing on. The second thing is working on this consent decree with the City of Chicago. I've spent the last 2 years working on police reform, and I know exactly what needs to happen with that police department. But the issues we face are broader than just here in Chicago. The issue of public safety is a statewide issue. We also need to work on fighting violent crime. That means smart gun control. And then, of course, I also agree with Mr. Goldstein that we need to work on over-incarceration and bail reform. When I was a federal prosecutor, I served on the Northern District Court's reentry program, and I saw the challenges that our prisoners face when they come out trying to rebuild their lives. They need support, they need mental health treatment, they need drug treatment, and they need education and housing and jobs. And so those are the kinds of things I'll be working on as Attorney General. Thank you.
Mr. Jury.
I'm proud to be one of the only Democrats that was appointed to the commission that we're talking about. I was a commissioner on there making those recommendations. One of my big issues was that this wasn't a menu of items that we could select from, that these were 25 comprehensive recommendations that together could dramatically reform our criminal justice system and reduce the prison population by 25% by 2025. A key aspect of those reforms is to make sure that we are not putting people who have mental illness and people who have drug addiction in prison. They should be going to rehabilitation, where they can be rehabilitated and become productive members of our society. In prison, we need to educate people so that when they get out, they can become productive members of our society. And we have to invest in our communities, both in terms of police and making sure that there are beat police on the street again, not what the President Donald Trump says of bringing the National Guard. That's the exact wrong thing to do. And we need to make sure that there's an ability for people to re-enter society. In Illinois, we have 700 different roadblocks to people getting jobs if they're felons. You can't be a blacksmith if you're a felon. We have to end that, and we have to give people the courage to take tough votes and know that they're not being soft on crime, they're being smart on crime, and I'm going to give them that cover as the Attorney General.
Thank you so much. So the second question is directed to Mrs. Rodering first, Mr. Quinn, Mr. Raoul, and then Mr. Mariotti. The state of Illinois Department of Corrections spends roughly $1.4 billion. In one study, a couple of years ago, it was found that the state spent more than $500 million incarcerating individuals from one community area on the Chicago's west side. As Attorney General, how do you think resources should be allocated to address mass incarceration, the spending on incarceration, and potential measures that would reduce these costs for the state? Mrs. Rodering.
So we've heard a number of issues, a number of elements that are contributing to this racist incarceration, I'll call it that. It's a disparate approach to arrest. It's a disparate approach to sentencing. It's a disparate approach to people being able to get out of jail, being trapped because they're poor. The amount that's spent, that could be spent on reentry programs and giving people the support they need. We know that 88% of people who are arrested for drug possession have on their person drugs for their personal use. That's a real opportunity to diminish the number of people who are unnecessarily incarcerated if we would just move forward and carefully and with appropriate regulations legalize marijuana. But we need to make sure that when people get out, they have the support that they need. Community policing is another critical piece, giving the police the resources that they know that they need to understand why people are frequent flyers, who has the mental health issue, who has the history of domestic violence, who has the drug abuse problem, gives us a sense of being able to be more thoughtful in our policing and more appropriate in our policing.
Thank you.
Well, I live in Austin, the neighborhood just referred to. I've lived there for 34 years on the west side of Chicago, and I think the best way to help prevent crime is to have a job. When I was governor, I made sure that we had a Put Illinois to Work program, that when ex-offenders came out of prison, they had an opportunity to get a job that paid a decent wage. I think it's very, very important, if we're going to reduce the expenditure of the Department of Corrections, that we have programs for men and women who want to work and don't want to repeat their crimes. I think it's also important to have programs like Redeploy, which are alternative sentencing, where you don't have to go to prison. Oftentimes you straighten out and go in a different path in life. Again, when I was governor, I did clemencies, over almost 5,000 clemencies, more than any governor in Illinois history, because there were people who did make mistakes, and they regretted those. They had remorse. They changed their lives, and I think that's another way to go forward in life, to make sure that we give people opportunity, and that's the best way to help the most people.
Thank you. Mr. Raoul.
I too served on the Criminal Justice Reform Commission. In fact, I also want to talk to Governor Rauner and suggested that that be something that he should turn his attention to. And I penned an op-ed together with him at the beginning of his administration, saying that we needed to work on this and reduce the prison population, which was about 48,000 at the time, in facilities designed to hold 32,000. So there's no corrections going on in the Department of Corrections, and that's one of the things that needs to go on, is rehabilitation for those who are who need to be incapacitated. But there's so many people in prison who need to be diverted. That's why I sponsored Redeploy Illinois. The problem is Redeploy Illinois, which is a diversion program that's supposed to shift resources to community, doesn't have enough resources behind the diversion programs. So we need to have the appropriate resources focused on that. Finally, the Attorney General's office has an opportunity to direct resources for victims. We have to begin to ask, to what extent do the most victimized communities get those resources?
Mr. Mariotti.
You know, I don't think spending money or diverting resources to one community or another is going to solve the problem of overcrowding in our prisons, of a prison system and a criminal justice system here in Illinois that imprisons too many people. What we need to do is have sentencing reform here in Illinois, to give judges more discretion on sentencing, to remove some of the mandatory minimums that we have, to give them guidelines that will lower the sentences for people. But we also have to look backwards. You know, if all these reforms are about looking forward and changing things going forward, what about all these people who are in prison right now? What we have to do, and I went to the United States Senate to talk about this, you know, before I was running for Attorney General, is that we need governors like the gubernatorial candidates here in Illinois to have a comprehensive program for clemencies, to use clemencies as a tool for criminal justice reform, to get a lot of these low-level drug offenders, other nonviolent offenders out of the prison system, so we can focus our efforts on white-collar crime, there isn't enough of that, and violent crime. That's what we need to do. Thank you.
Thank you. This next question is centered on workplace rights and advocacy for employees in the state of Illinois. This first question will be for Mr. Drury, Mrs. Rotering, Mr. Ruiz, and Mr. Goldstein. And the question is, how can the Illinois Attorney General do more to protect the interests of Illinois workers?
Workplace rights of any man, woman, anyone working in Illinois is critical. And the Attorney General is on the front lines of that, whether it's bringing civil rights litigation to make sure that everybody is entitled to get a job, whether it's bringing litigation against employers to make sure that workers are treated fairly, whether it's advocating for legislation, as I've advocated for in the General Assembly, to make sure that every person, regardless of your race, regardless of your color, regardless of your sexual orientation, earns a fair wage for a fair hour worked. We need to be advocating for those things. I'm disappointed that in Illinois, in a democratic state, that we have not been able to pass the progressive agenda when it comes to workplace rights that we need to have. Even when we had a Democratic governor, minimum wage, when we had a Democratic governor and supermajorities in the House and the Senate, we were not able to pass a minimum wage. The first time that we did it was this year, when we didn't have the votes to actually override a veto. Those are political games that are being played by Democrats while we're holding out our own constituents for political gain. That has to stop. And as the Attorney General, I'm going to speak out against the shenanigans, not only that Republicans have, but that we're all doing to make sure that everybody is benefiting. I'm going to be the attorney for all of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Mrs. Rotering.
So when we think about workplace rights, we think about wages, we think about benefits, we think about safety, we think about retirement, we think about all of these pieces, and that's an opportunity for somebody to both file litigation when rules aren't being followed, to be a watchdog when safety issues are arising, and to also be an advocate, to speak out on behalf of the working men and women of our state. They are the backbone of our state, they're the backbone of our country, and then let's fold in the piece of harassment in the workplace, whether it's gender, race, orientation, and so forth. Our workers deserve and need that watchdog. They need that advocate. They need somebody who understands the issues that they're facing every single day. If your employer is changing the way your job is being categorized, so you're no longer an employee but considered a contractor, you're at risk for losing wages, benefits, safety, and a safe retirement. You need someone who understands the issues that face people who work in our state and in our country. I want to be that advocate.
Thank you. Mr. Ruiz.
Well, the office does have a workforce bureau, and that will enhance that bureau with making sure there is a person appointed to liaise with the labor community and making sure the rights of all workers are upheld. But something that you have to think about is some of these cases you just don't create. Some people have to bring you these cases. So building those bridges with communities and worker organizations. As the first Latino Attorney General and as a pro bono attorney, I've defended folks, waiters, restaurant staff, who are victims of wage theft. And if I couldn't speak to them in Spanish, I wouldn't get the case. So I look forward to building those communities with immigrant communities who are always the primary targets of wage theft because they can't defend themselves, and they're oftentimes afraid to come forward and bring these cases. And I'll make sure no one's ever afraid to bring a case to the Illinois Attorney General's office. We'll speak to them where they are in their language, and I'll make sure that the rights of all workers through the Workforce Bureau, through the Civil Rights Office, will be upheld and protected. As the son of a migrant farm worker, it's utmost important to me.
Thank you. Mr. Goldstein.
So I guess the question we have to ask, if we're Attorney General, is are you for the people or are you for the corporations? Are you for unions and workers or are you for the big powers? And the reality is the legislature has failed the working people. When they passed a pension bill that deprived the pensions of people that worked their entire career, they let down the workers. So what needs to happen? The Attorney General needs to step up and fight on behalf of the workers, fight on behalf of the unions. Those are the backbone of our community, of our economy, and our society. So as Attorney General, number one, you got to be a friend to the worker, a friend to the union. And that's what I'll be as Attorney General, and fighting for the rights of every single worker in the state of Illinois.
Thank you. This next question is also related to workplace rights, and it will be directed to Mrs. Fairley, Mr. Raul, Mr. Mariotti, and Mr. Quinn. Janice v. AFSCME is a case that is being heard by the Supreme Court this February. Just a little bit of background for the audience. It is the latest union dues case that raises the question of whether public employees must pay dues even if they disagree with their union's position. The case pits unions who say mandatory fees are necessary to prevent so-called free riders from benefiting from union contracts against dissenting members who argue that being forced to pay union dues violates their First Amendment rights. So the question for the respondents, what is your take on the Janice case? And in the event that AFSCME is unsuccessful in its argument, what measures would you take as Attorney General to protect workers' rights?
So yes, this is a very unfortunate circumstance that the Supreme Court has agreed to hear this case. I actually agree with the position that Lisa Madigan took and the amicus brief that she filed on behalf of the union in this case. Collective bargaining is a really important aspect of how we protect workers' rights, and I support that unions have the right to collective bargaining, and the dues that are going towards the collective bargaining that benefit every member of the union are really, really important. And so unfortunately, it looks like the court may go the other way. I'm hopeful that they won't, but there is that possibility. So if that does happen, then we have to look to protect collective bargaining to the extent that we can. And we have to look at all the other ways to protect workers' rights, including things like promoting the minimum wage, making sure that we are vigilant about violations of employment pay for hours worked. I actually prosecuted a case as a federal prosecutor where an organization was cheating employees out of the hours that they worked. So I have experience investigating these kinds of cases. So that's what we need to do going forward, is to just be very vigilant in protecting workers' rights. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Raul.
Thank you. The right to organize and the ability to collect dues has led to the creation of the middle class. I mean, to have unions represent to represent employees not only provides for livable wage, it provides for safe working conditions, it provides for not being abused by rogue employers. And this is being threatened. This is being threatened by our governor and certainly by the Supreme Court and certainly from the White House. With regards to protecting workers, if the Janus is overturned, or if the Supreme Court rules as if we expect them to, I've already introduced legislation to make sure that we are able to bypass the Department of Labor when there are violations, be it wage theft, prevailing wage, misclassification of worker, failure to pay minimum wage. These things are going on. There are claims that are being stalled in the Department of Labor, and when I'm Attorney General, I'll be able to bypass the Department of Labor and go directly to enforce these claims.
Thank you. Mr. Mariotti.
So the Janus case is just one part of an assault on unions. And the reason that unions are under assault is because they're the one group, frankly, in the political system that organizes working people and gets their money and resources pooled together. And so the Republicans are doing everything they can to undercut them. And unfortunately, I don't have good news for you because I'm pretty convinced that Janus is going to go the wrong way. And that's partly because the Republicans stole a Senate seat, or excuse me, stole a, well, they've tried to do that at times too, but they stole a Supreme Court seat from us. So unfortunately, we do have to prepare, and we do need to introduce legislation that helps us counteract some of the bad effects of Janus. California did that. They passed legislation to help educate union members regarding the values of paying dues and the values of being in their union. That's one thing that we can do, and it's something that we have to do because, frankly, free riding is a very tempting thing. If you're in a union, you don't have to pay your dues and you get the benefit of it. That sounds like a good thing at first glance. But we have to do a lot more to try to help organize and protect workers in Illinois, and that's just one piece of it. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Quinn.
Well, the right to organize is a fundamental right in America, and it's under attack. This case, Janus, is before the U.S. Supreme Court. It was earlier attacked in Harris v. Quinn. That was the Quinn. And we've got to make sure that we fight as hard as we can for the right of public employees to have a union and to support their union and not to have free riders. I think it is important to have the Attorney General help educate the workers of our public employee unions across Illinois on how important it is to have a union. As governor of our state, I signed a number of bills to protect the right to organize, but also to protect workers. One of the bills was pregnancy discrimination against pregnant women in the workplace, sometimes done by public employers, including school districts here in Chicago. And we had to get that law passed, and I signed it into law, and that's one of the things that unions do. They protect their workers and their working conditions as well as their wages and their right to an opportunity to have a middle-class life.
Thank you, Mr. Quinn. So we are going to turn our attention to corruption in the state of Illinois. It's everyone's favorite topic. So we have much to talk about, and we could spend the whole debate on this issue. But I have two questions. Again, this will be divided into two. So the first question will be directed to Mr. Ruiz, Mr. Drury, Mr. Goldstein, and Mrs. Fairley. And then the second question will be for Mr. Quinn, Mrs. Rotary, Mr. Raoul, and Mr. Mariotti. So the first question on this issue of corruption in the state of Illinois. In 10 years, the current Attorney General only prosecuted 14 public officials for corruption. Considering Illinois' track record, as well as considering that Illinois has 7,000 units of government, that number may seem to be a little low. Do you think the current Attorney General has gone far enough to go after public corruption, especially in politics? And number two, what public corruption issue would you spearhead as Attorney General? Mr. Ruiz.
Obviously, it's something we're not proud of in Illinois, the amount of corruption we've put up with, and the tools that the Attorney General is given are limited, frankly. And so, first day in office, I want to make sure that I get additional tools to make sure we can go after corruption wherever it sits, and also continue to enforce vigorously the Open Meetings Act, the Freedom of Information Act, and call out wrongdoing where you see it. I mean, in the recent case of Forrest Claypool at CPS, I was the first person who called it out, reported it to the chief ethics officer, which started the whole first domino going. And it wasn't something I was happy to do, but even though he was a colleague, when you see something that's wrong, you call it out. You have the courage to stand up and say that's wrong, even when it may cost you a seat on a board. And so I've done that throughout my legal career. I look forward to doing it as Attorney General more vigorously and leading what I've always done, serving with integrity and making sure that business of government is done in open meetings. I've also called out my former colleagues at CPS. Those board meetings are not done in open meetings. The briefings are not done. They should be, and we'll make sure to continue to enforce the current tools and seek additional tools to root out corruption.
Thank you. Mr. Jury.
As a federal prosecutor, I proudly prosecuted a friend and appointee of Governor Blagojevich, and we need to do a lot more of that, not on the federal side, but in the state of Illinois. As the Attorney General, I'm going to make sure that we bring in the best prosecutors, we bring in the best investigators, so we don't have to outsource our public corruption fighting abilities to the federal authorities. We are going to end patronage that plagued the Quinn administration and currently plagues the Democratic Party. Patronage is one of the single biggest problems in the state of Illinois because the best people are not getting the jobs that they deserve. It's going to friends and family. We are going to end pay to play, where we give out contracts to people not because they deserve them, but because they've made political contributions to the right people. That has to end in the state of Illinois. As Attorney General, I am going to go wherever the evidence leads. If there's evidence that a crime has been committed by the Speaker of the House, we will indict the Speaker of the House. If there's evidence that a crime has been committed by the President of the Senate, by the Governor, by any local official, we will indict any of those people. The tone will be set at the top, and we are going to stop corruption in the state of Illinois once and for all.
Thank you. Mr. Goldstein.
So the question was, has Lisa Madigan done enough to go after corruption? The answer is no. She said in 2003 that she will make corruption a priority, even if that means investigating her own father. Yeah. Here we are, 2018, and I don't believe that's happened. So at least a conflict of interest will be eliminated with a new Attorney General. First thing I will do as Attorney General is form a Public Integrity Bureau, much like they have in New York with Eric Schneiderman, the Attorney General there. The number one and only goal of that bureau is to investigate corruption. But we must also look at a bigger issue, and that's money in politics. And the fact is, there's too much, and the fact is there is money in politics. We cannot have that. So we need to work together to eliminate money from politics. And that's the most important thing to end corruption.
Thank you. Mrs. Fairley.
So I've had the opportunity to work on this issue both as a federal prosecutor and also as the first Deputy Inspector General for the City of Chicago. These are really, really important issues. And I agree that the office needs to do more, much more. First of all, we know that the legislature went for 3 years without a legislative inspector general. That is unconscionable. That was a requirement by law. And without pointing any fingers to about how that happened and why that went on for so long, I won't go there. But I will start by first working to change the statute that governs the Legislative Inspector General and the Ethics Commission to give both bodies more teeth. Second, I will stand up a public integrity task force that will coordinate law enforcement, the state's attorneys, to make sure that they have the experience, the expertise, and the political will to prosecute public corruption cases. And then, of course, I will work inside the office to devote resources to make sure that we have the resources to go after those cases and hold people accountable the way that they're just not being held accountable today.
Thank you. The second question is directed to Mr. Quinn, Mrs. Rodering, Mr. Raoul, and Mr. Mariotti. So often it seems that the rights of residents of Illinois take a back seat to large corporations and powerful political interests. What issues can you describe where you think average residents are being harmed by these powerful corporations? And what would you do to advocate for those residents? Mr. Quinn.
One of the key roles of the Attorney General is to represent utility consumers against big utility companies. It's hard for one person to take on a giant corporation like Commonwealth Edison or Exelon or Peoples Gas or Nicor. But that's what we did 35 years ago. Started a Citizen Utility Board, a grassroots organization that I believe in, I'm a member of, I helped organize it, and I think it's important for the Attorney General to work with the Citizen Utility Board to make sure that everyday people are not treated unfairly with their electric rates or their gas rates or their phone rates, whatever the case might be. I think we really need to have an organization like that, not only for utilities, but to take on banks and big insurance companies. Oftentimes, it's hard for one person to take on a giant bank with unfair ATM fees or an insurance company that's taking advantage of people on their health insurance. We need a financial consumer association that the Attorney General ought to help organize to make sure that the voice of the consumer is heard.
Thank you. Mrs. Rodering.
When I first ran for office, I ran against 3 men who were incumbents whose race was being run by the then mayor. I came in first place, and that was because I rang every doorbell and spoke to residents and understood what was on their minds. 2 years later, I ran again against the establishment and became the first woman mayor of my community. A few months after that, I had the opportunity to lead my council in banning assault weapons in large capacity magazines. You want to talk about residents standing up to a large corporation? Let's talk about the gun industry and the havoc that they've wreaked not only in our city, but in our state and in our country. I know what it takes to stand up to power. I know what it takes to find opportunities, to pull together resources, to gather momentum, and to have the courage to do what's right. I've done that against the NRA. I've done that against major utilities. I know how to get things done. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Raoul.
To tie this to a response to a previous question, I think what the powerful corporations are doing with the help of our current governor is trying to create a more of a wealth gap, keeping profits and not paying fair wages, and trying to drive down working conditions. And we've heard about wage theft, and so what I would do, I would have the capacity to do as Attorney General, is to take on some of those powerful corporations and again go directly towards making sure the valid claims of employees being taken advantage of by these corporations are pursued aggressively by the Attorney General's office. I would create, as has been done in California, a workers' protection task force working along with local prosecutors so we could effectively pursue these cases.
Thank you. Mr. Mariotti.
You know, we've been talking a lot about what we can do and what we have done in the past to take on powerful interests, but frankly, it is the most important thing that you can do as Attorney General. It is the #1 reason why I am running for this job, because frankly, there are powerful interests out there that are really taking on, you know, all of us. We are all getting screwed by powerful interests out there that are taking on and really making it hard for people like my parents to compete. I mean, my dad's a cashier at Walmart. He doesn't get the hours he needs, he doesn't get the wages he deserves, and how is he going to stand up to a corporation like that? All of us, we at times, we've gotten screwed by financial institutions. Now the Trump administration has taken away our ability to go to the courts. They've allowed financial institutions to force us all into arbitration. You need an Attorney General, when everyone gets harmed by just a small amount, to bring actions on behalf of all of us, on behalf of large segments of people. When I was a federal prosecutor, I was the first prosecutor in the country at any office, anywhere, to convict a high-frequency trader. Who are these people who use the computers to manipulate the financial markets? I went after big banks, people who are worth hundreds of millions of dollars. I could do the same thing as Attorney General on your behalf.
Thank you. This next subject area is dealing with police misconduct and reform. Again, there are 2 questions. The first question will be directed to Mr. Goldstein, Mr. Fairley, Mrs. Rodering, and Mr. Ruiz. and then the second question for the remainder of the candidates. So the first question is, what path would you advocate to remove the impediments to holding police accountable across the state? Do you agree with a consent decree to hold police districts accountable for the implementation of police reforms? Mr. Goldstein.
So every single day, I represent the victims of police misconduct. Every single day in the criminal justice system, there are police officers that lie against my clients. Every single day I see that. Every single day I see the person with the badge walk in, swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, and they're believed as if it's the gospel. So this is the unique perspective that I offer. What needs to happen? I agree with Attorney General Madigan's suit to have a consent decree, but we need to go further. Now, you understand who's joining in that suit. It's the city of Chicago. Who's our mayor? Rahm Emanuel, the same guy that covered up the shooting of Laquan McDonald. Do we trust that? So what I propose is that the community have enforcement power, that they have the ability to come into court and enforce that consent decree. That will take us a long way for police reform and police accountability.
Thank you. Mrs. Fairley.
I've spent the last 2 years thinking a lot about this and working a lot on this challenge, and it is a challenge. Let me tell you where I'd start. Obviously, the first thing is I support a consent decree with the City of Chicago. There's a lot of work to be done there. We need to ensure that accountability is basically baked into all aspects of the department, from recruiting, training, policies, evaluations, as well as the accountability system. So it's not enough just to have punishment at the end. You need to make sure that the department brings accountability into its culture. Then we need to work on that statewide, which means we need to get more regulation and rules of the road about how officers are recruited, trained, and the accountability systems that are in place to hold them accountable when they make a mistake. So these are things that are definitely within the purview of the Attorney General, and those are the things that I'd like to work on. Thanks.
Thank you. Mr. Jury. I'm sorry. Yes, Mrs. Rodering. Sorry, thank you for that. Oh, no.
Ready to go on this one. To your point, this is a tremendous issue of complexity and importance in Chicago. It's also an issue in Waukegan and other areas where we have communities who are disparately impacted, frankly, because of the color of their skin. I know that there were $26 million in damages paid out in Waukegan just last year in improper police conduct and so forth. So to echo what Sharon said, yes, I would absolutely support the consent decree. It needs to have substance, it needs to have teeth, it needs to have community involvement. You need to have very clear metrics. You need to provide resources then to require those metrics. You need to have some sort of reporting process. You also need to be able to talk about the community's involvement, because we know that policing isn't a very clear binary question, that there are nuances within communities driven by the acuity of crime, the acuity and presence of mental health issues, domestic violence, and so forth. So these pieces all need to be part of that complex equation, and it absolutely needs to be under the purview of the Attorney General to be that watchdog, to demand the accountability, and then to hold people responsible if they fail to meet those metrics.
Thank you. Mr. Ruiz.
The great thing about Democrats is we're pretty much all on the same page on this issue. I tend to agree with everything my colleagues have said, and just highlight 2 points. And something we've done in the teaching profession, where we have degrees in law enforcement. My alma mater, University of Illinois, gives them. We go back to colleges of education and we tell them how to train our teachers. Well, we don't start at the very beginning and tell programs that train officers what they should be training them for. Do they have cultural sensitivity? And are we recruiting diverse members of our community to enter the law enforcement profession? So yes, we'll have the consent decree. We'll have a community component to oversee that. And we'll make sure the culture will change. But you got to start from the very beginning and change the culture from the very beginning, and how they're trained, how they're recruited, making sure that there's continuing professional education for officers. There are some bad apples, but there's some very good officers who put their lives on the line every day to serve and protect us. We need to support them, make sure they get the counseling and the mindfulness training that lawyers now have to do, they should do it because they're in a high stressful job. And we have to appreciate that, support them, to help them rebuild that trust with community and begin there from the very beginning.
Thank you. The second question is directed to Mr. Quinn, Mr. Raul, Mr. Mariotti, and Mr. Jury. So the second question is, what role should consent decrees play in driving reform and decreasing police violence while increasing the respect with which law enforcement treats people?
I think this is a fundamental moment for Illinois and especially Chicago where I live, that we have a police department that obeys the rules at all times. I've walked in marches on both west side and south side of Chicago. Community members feel that the police department needs fundamental reform, and that's what the consent decree is designed to do. I echo the remarks that we need to strongly support the consent decree with resources, accountability. We also have to, I think, recruit men and women to the police department who understand the high ideals that the department must uphold. I went to a number of police funerals when I was governor and saw the great heroic action of police officers who were doing the right thing at all times, helping the community. And I think it's important that we work with the police officers who understand that their duty is to serve and protect us and do everything possible with this consent decree to honor that service. At the same time, we make sure that everyone's accountable.
Thank you. Mr. Raul.
One of the challenges with the consent decrees is they're after the fact. I worked on a law enforcement reform bill, and part of our negotiations, and we had negotiations with the ACLU at the table, law enforcement at the table, and one of the things I was pushing for was what we have for most of the professions in the state, licensing. We license lawyers, we license physicians, we license barbers and hairdressers, but we don't license people who are authorized to carry deadly force. The only thing that will make folks not abuse their authority is consequence if they do. If you have a real consequence, if somebody abuses the authority given to them, which is an incredible authority, the only thing can do that is if you violate the rules that are supposed to dictate your behavior as a police officer, you lose your license to work as a police officer. And that'll be the only thing that will turn this around.
Thank you. Mr. Mariotti.
So I think the question was about consent decrees. And look, I support the current consent decree that Attorney General Madigan brought, but that is seeking, I should say, in the suit that she's brought. But that is something that is really not a way to reform police departments statewide. It's not a way that you're going to reform police departments on a regular basis. It's something you do as a reaction, an extreme reaction to a crisis. But what we have to do, to me, it's not education, it's not licensing. I think those things are fine. I'm not saying that they're wrong, but as somebody who investigated police officers who were involved in misconduct at times, really what you have to do is make sure that police officers are playing by the same rules as everyone else. First of all, that when there's a shooting, for example, involving a police officer, that they don't have the right to speak to people before they're interviewed by somebody at the state's attorney's office. That was, in my opinion, one of the things that made it hard to look at those cases. And also, we also have to make sure that frankly there's light drawn to cases that aren't prosecuted, so that people know the facts and understand what happened, so that police officers see some accountability for what happened, even if they aren't indicted or convicted.
Thank you. Mr. Jury.
Unfortunately, in Illinois, there's a lot of political tricks that go on, and one of those tricks is that you enter a consent decree, you all have a big press conference, and then you say, job done, and then no one enforces the consent decree. As Attorney General, I will make sure that doesn't happen. I've already taken steps to find out what would be the best processes to enforce this consent decree. I've met with a professor at the University of Chicago, who's also an attorney and one of the lead lawyers for the community in bringing lawsuits against the police department in relation to this consent decree. But that's not enough just to talk about consent decrees. One thing I learned as a prosecutor is that organized crime is so effective in Illinois and other states because they put their friends into positions of power. They get the mayor in power, they get the police chief in power, and they're free to do whatever they want. In this race, there are candidates who are being backed by the same people who are going to oppose that consent decree. Now, we know that when that happens, they are not going to stand up for the public. They're going to stand up to make sure that that consent decree is not enforced. My commitment to the public is to make sure that every day we're working on behalf of the public. We're working to make sure that people can trust their government, and a huge part of that is to make sure that they can trust that every police officer on the streets is serving and protecting them.
Thank you. So we're going to switch gears just a little bit. We're going to switch topics, and then we'll get into politics after this next question. But this next question has been a top-line story for quite a while in the state of Illinois, and I think it's important that all of the candidates have an opportunity to respond. So this question is for everyone, and we'll start with Mr. Quinn and just go down in order from there. Over the last year, there has been a lot of attention on the state's property tax system and what has been called an inequitable assessment process that disproportionately harms low-income residents and homeowners, particularly in Cook County. In many instances, law firms that represent wealthier property tax clients are also elected officials or have elected officials who work for those firms. Do you believe that it is ethical for elected representatives to also serve as property tax appeals lawyers? Is this an issue you would take a stance on as Attorney General? And if so, what would be your stance on the issue? Mr. Quinn.
First office I was elected to as Commissioner of the Board of Property Tax Appeals in Cook County. I was the only commissioner, only assessor in Cook County history never to take a campaign contribution from a lawyer who practiced before me. I think that ought to be banned by law. With respect to elected officials who practice property tax law, I think we need a strict conflict of interest law in our state that would not only govern property tax lawyers, but anybody who's voting on bills in Springfield if it affects their financial interest. I think that's the best way to deal with that particular issue. I'm particularly concerned about the issue of unfair assessment, particularly of people who own modest homes in minority neighborhoods. When I was on the Board of Appeals, I worked on that issue. I asked under the Freedom of Information Act to get the computer variables that would show exactly how they're doing things down at the assessor's office. They've refused to do that for years and years. I think we should pass a law requiring that disclosure of information. The Attorney General should be at the forefront of making sure we have a fair property tax system and do whatever is necessary in federal court or state court to get the job done.
Thank you. Mr. Ruiz.
Again, I have to concur that you have to have a very strong conflict of interest. There is too much intermingling of public officials and public officials engaged in the business of government and politics, and that simply has to stop. We can't have that, and that's what leads to so much of the issues. We won't have to worry so much about going after, there'll be a lot less of it once you take out the ability to make money off of the government and be able to, in any shape or form. And again, starting from the very beginning, making sure the assessments are done properly, that you have a citizens review body that is attached to the assessor's office. We're not the only county in Illinois that would have these issues, and making sure that large corporations that can afford the best legal talent have the ability to get rebates and that other average homeowners can't get. So definitely we have to do those things.
It is a complete conflict of interest, and there's absolutely no reason that people who are elected to represent you are then also able to make a buck off of poorly representing you. I would absolutely call for a third-party oversight and demand that there be accountability, have things published in the newspaper by neighborhood, by ward, by county, by township, whatever it takes to give people the information that they need. We know that when you have access to information, you can hold people accountable, but from the very beginning, the culture is set from the top. And the Attorney General needs to make sure that there is no opportunity for this conflict of interest. There is absolutely no reason why people who are elected to represent you are able to make a buck off of this business. There's a conflict there. When I became mayor, I brought in new regulations in terms of people who were representing private citizens then coming before the city, and also representing the city on commissions. I've got experience in this area. It takes that kind of leadership and that kind of courage to step up and say this is unacceptable.
I think this is one where there's going to be widespread agreement. I think the first problem is that the way that property taxes are assessed needs to be comprehensively changed. It's a scam to have an assessment that is over-assessed, particularly in disadvantaged neighborhoods where folks don't have access to these attorneys, and then major corporations that have big buildings have access to these attorneys and get their property taxes reduced. We need to just revamp the way property taxes are assessed. We need to make sure that particularly folks in disadvantaged neighborhoods whose schools are being shut down and who are being overly taxed because they're not being appropriately funded from the state with regards to education, have to lose their homes because of being over-assessed. And then there needs to be clear conflict of interest provisions to make sure that folks are not taking advantage of this scam.
You know, I think that this problem that we've been talking about with property taxes is sort of a symptom of something much larger. You know, in this state, I think we've come to expect the bare minimum from our politicians. I mean, these people go down to Springfield, or they're here in the city or wherever, and we expect them to just barely follow the law and figure out a way to sort of just barely get there. And then we might change the law. I mean, there's been some talk up here, we'll add a new conflict of interest law, and then they will slightly move from that very low bar to a slightly higher bar. And I think what we need to do more of in this state is we need to shine some sunshine on what's going on. You know, if I was Attorney General, what I would do, because this is something that has generated a lot of distrust amongst the public, let's investigate it. Let's issue a public report about what we find, and then let's let the people decide exactly what they like or don't like about these individuals who've been engaged in the system, because I suspect that some of these people who've been following the law have been doing things that most of us will regard as pretty unethical and crooked. We need a heck of a lot more of that in Illinois. Thank you.
Let's just be honest. Let's name names, right? Joe Barrios, Mike Madigan, Ed Burke. As the first committeeman to endorse Fritz Kagi, I was proud of that. And we have to call it what it is. Unethical? Sure. Corrupt. It's corrupt. And what I mentioned when we talked about corruption, it's getting money out of politics. Because you have a lot of candidates before you, and you should look at where everyone's getting their money from. So if an Attorney General candidate comes before you and their job is to regulate the utilities and they're getting 20 grand from the utility companies, you should look into that. If the Attorney General's job is to look into the tobacco companies and they're getting 100 grand from big tobacco, you need to look at that. So let's call it what it is. Let's be honest. It's corrupt, and let's name names.
Let me just add to what Mr. Goldstein says, right? If you have a candidate who's accepted tens of thousands of dollars from the individuals that we're talking about to support his campaign, then that's something that you ought to look at, right? This is a huge problem. There are a lot of things that I think need to be done. First, we have to investigate what's going on here, and as was said, shine white light on it. I'd love to see a special prosecutor assigned to investigate this affair, because if there's criminal conduct that's taken place, then it needs to be brought to light and punished. But we need to have more checks and balances in place to prevent these things from happening. We need a conflict of interest policy that is actually enforced in the state. We need political actors who actually have the political will to hold each other accountable. So that's what I will bring to the party as Attorney General.
I'm glad that we stopped sugarcoating the nice term conflict of interest. The issue, like we were talking about a few minutes ago, the issue is corruption, be it moral corruption, be it ethical corruption, be it criminal corruption. It is totally corrupt for somebody to have their building assessed 30% higher than it should be assessed, only to hire Mike Madigan's firm to get it lowered by Joe Barrios, who Mike Madigan put into office, and then Mike Madigan's firm takes 30% off of the reduction in the property tax bill and makes millions. One of the first bills I introduced as a state representative was to make sure that the Speaker of the House could not have any outside employment, to go directly at this issue. As a candidate in my first election, when I had no political experience, friends of Mike Madigan donated $20,000 to me. You can check my report. I wrote a letter and I sent it right back to him. And when it came time this year to vote for Speaker of the House, I did not vote for him. So when we talk about courage and we talk about who is really going to change this system, who has shown the backbone to make the change, to stand up to the most powerful people in the state of Illinois, my record speaks for itself, and I will continue to do that as your Attorney General.
Thank you, Mr. Jury. That's actually the perfect lead into this next set of questions. And so we're moving into a phase where, again, this is a question that all of you will be expected to respond to. It is a yes or no question. This is the topic of politics, electoral politics. And so we think that it is important for the members of this audience to have a sense of where you stand on the political spectrum, as well as where your political allegiances and supports go. So again, each question is just yes or no. We'll start with, I guess this time we'll start with Mr. Jury. We'll give Mr. Quinn a break for the moment. So again, this is about candidate support. Do you support the following people continuing in the current office when they are up for re-election? Michael Madigan as Speaker of the House.
No. No.
Term limits. Mr. Raul said he supports term limits. Next question. John Cullerton is president of the Senate. Do you support his, when he's up for re-election, would you support John Cullerton as president of the Senate? Thank you. So we're going to switch to city, and we'll start with Mr. Quinn. Again, the question is, do you support the following people continuing in the current office when they are up for re-election? Rahm Emanuel as mayor of the city of Chicago. The final question, do you support this individual continuing in their current office when they are up for re-election? Cook County Board President Tony Preckwinkle. We'll start with you, Scott.
No, I think that, again, for term limits,
If you could, yeah, you'll have to shout if you're not going up to the mic.
the answer was no. I think for term limit reasons, we should always be putting new people into office.
I agree.
No. Yes.
So we actually have one more that I almost forgot. We'll start with Mr. Quinn. Do you support the following individual continuing in the current office when they're up for re-election? Joe Barrios as chair of the Cook County Democratic Party and Cook County Assessor. Yes, you do. You can respond in 30 seconds. Yes.
I think it's very interesting that a gentleman who sought the endorsement of the party thinks that the party shouldn't endorse. That's hypocrisy. That's the ultimate hypocrisy. With regards to the continuation of Barrios' assessor, I think that's a definite term limit.
Thank you.
No, and just to be clear, and I think the governor would agree with me, I went before the Cook County Democratic Party and asked for an open primary, even for my seat, even though I had a vote. So I just want to make sure the facts are clear. I know the governor asked for an open primary as well.
So for the record, Mr. Goldstein, Mr. Ruiz, and Governor Quinn asked for an open primary from the Democratic Party.
Absolutely not.
So those last two responses, again, were on Assessor Joe Barrios in his role as assessor and his role with the Democratic Party. So thank you. We're going to now, just to get a better sense of your background, now that that is out of the way, so we can all take a breath. These next questions are really to get a better sense of you as members of the Democratic Party and your stance on a lot of the issues that the Democrats have been dealing with, particularly since the 2016 election. So this first question is for Mr. Quinn, Mr. Ruiz, Mrs. Rodering, and Mr. Raul. And that question is, what lessons have you learned or have members of the Democratic Party learned from the 2016 election, specifically from the defeat of the Democratic Party's candidate, Hillary Clinton, and the Democrats performing poorly down ballot in spite of high turnout? So what lessons have been learned from the 2016 election?
Well, I believe on knocking on doors and passing petitions. I think there wasn't anywhere enough of that in the general election campaign that Hillary Clinton ran. I know analytics are fine, but there's nothing better than knocking on doors and talking to people. Over the course of my public life, I've helped collect over 4 million signatures, petition signatures of everyday people. I think the Democratic Party's got to get back to grassroots democracy. I believe in the opportunity to vote not only in good candidates, but on referendum issues that really matter to everyday people. And I think that's what our party's got to focus on: economic justice, making sure we have civil rights always protected, and making sure everyday people have a voice in their own government. So I think that is really the lesson learned from 2016. If we're going to take on Trumpism, we've got to do it in a grassroots way. We've got to band together in the best traditions of Illinois democracy: early to bed, early to rise, work like hell, and organize.
Thank you. Mr. Ruiz.
I think the lesson learned is that, with working families, we're looking for an alternative. We're looking for somebody new. We're looking for somebody who's talking to them about their issues. And as Democrats, particularly at the national level, we did not do that. Yes, we talked about Donald Trump, but we didn't say, in the alternative, this is what you get with us. And unfortunately, that's what we're not, we're losing that focus, and that's one of my greatest focuses, why I want to be your Attorney General, is working families like mine, still in the far south side of Chicago in the Roseland community that face all kinds of challenges. And are we addressing those challenges? Are we addressing the disparity and the wealthiest Americans getting more and more wealth? The Forbes 400, going up 2,800% when the rest of us going up 180% in the last 30-something years. Those issues that we need to address and bring new people who aren't the same old folks. So as a first-time candidate for elective office, that's why I want to be your Attorney General as well.
Thank you. Mrs. Rodering.
So I did get my start in grassroots organizing, and we know that organizing is where we need to focus. We need to get our young people involved. We need to give them a sense of the historic magnitude that happens when you don't show up. We need to give them a reason to care, and part of that reason to care is to get good candidates to run for office. I'm the proud former president of the Illinois Women's Institute for Leadership. We train women in Illinois, Democratic women, to run for office. You need to get those people that those community leaders who will inspire others to show up and give them the support they need. We need to talk about corporate money in elections, and we need to talk about evening the playing field so that everybody has the opportunity to run to be representative in this office. It's a difficult situation that we have right now, given the way that our campaigns are run. We need to even the playing field, we need to organize, and we need to build our bench.
I think the mistake that was made was ignoring the base of the party. I think this vision of trying to focus on working to the middle has been a huge mistake, because the middle, quite frankly, has moved to the right. We have to refocus on the base, on the disenfranchised, on the people who are hurting, because I believe those are the people who are the traditional base of the Democratic Party.
Thank you. This next question is from Mr. Mariotti, Mr. Goldstein, Mrs. Fairley, and Mr. Jury. The Democratic Party is often accused of identity politics while failing to deliver for its major voting blocs of people of color. What should the Democratic Party do to attract and lift up candidates of different ethnicities, as well as adhere to the whims of the major voting blocs, people of color?
Well, for one thing, I think that the Democratic Party has the history of coming around to certain communities when it's election time. We have politicians who do that, and then you don't see them for 2 years, 4 years, 6 years, whatever the term of office is, and they don't really ultimately follow through and do anything for that issue, for issues for those communities. And frankly, the best way to change that, for example, as Attorney General, is to hire people who look like the state of Illinois in that office. And that will generate the biggest amount of change, is to take people from those communities and have them in positions of power. Now, I am fortunate, I've got a lot of volunteers on my campaign, and some of them work at the Attorney General's office and talk about the lack of diversity and leadership there. That's a problem. And that's a problem, frankly, in a lot of areas of Illinois government, and politicians who go to communities of color and then just ignore them after Election Day is something that we need to stop doing.
Thank you. Mr. Goldstein.
I think the term identity politics is a pejorative. What it basically says is, if we're supporting people of color, if we're supporting women, somehow that's identity politics. But when it's nothing but white men that have been politicians for centuries, that's okay. So we need to get rid of that term. Here's what we need to get back to, and what I think Democrats should be about. And that is about the people and about being genuine for all people. Okay, so when we have fake Democrats who are not for the people, whatever their skin color, whatever their gender, it doesn't matter. If they're not for the people, we need to get rid of them. And we need to be bold and actually standing up. See, part of the first question was some of the mistakes that were made within the Democrats. And the problem is this whole idea of electability. And I hear this question all the time: who's electable? Who's electable? That's not helping the people. The people will decide. And as a proud supporter of Bernie Sanders, what we need to realize is someone who's actually genuine, someone who's standing up and fighting for all of us and calling it what it is. That's the most important, and I think that will show in any race that Democrats run.
Thank you. Mrs. Fairley.
I think we've learned over the past few months how important the communities of color are to our politics. The wins in Alabama and in Virginia were by and large due to the strength and the output of the African American community and African American women in general, and specifically, right? I am running as the only African American woman in this race, and I'll tell you, I barely got the time of day from our party. Our party does not support, in Illinois they have this thing about, we don't want anybody nobody sent. You know what? I sent me, right? I sent me. And I'm running to be the first African American female Attorney General in Illinois, and only the fourth nationwide, because you know what? Time is up. Time is up. Time is now. People talk about the need for more women of color in positions of political power all the time, but then they don't give them the support and resources that they need to pull it off. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm working hard for my campaign to get those resources and to get the job done. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Jury.
When you look at the issues of 2014 when Bruce Rauner was elected and 2016 when Trump was elected, the issue wasn't that Bruce Rauner won that election. And it wasn't that Trump won the election. We as Democrats lost that election. We didn't give people a reason to vote for Democrats. Democrats had given up on the Democratic Party because they saw these powerful interests making decisions that don't benefit Democrats. They saw promise after promise not coming true, and frankly, they didn't believe it. So what you saw in 2016 is you saw Bernie Sanders supporters on the margins and Trump supporters ended up being the same people. And you had Bernie supporters ended up voting for Trump. What does that tell you? They wanted to blow it up because they were sick of the system. They were sick of the system. If we want to rebuild the Democratic Party to be a party that is going to be strong in Illinois for decades to come, we have to get rid of the machine that caused the problems that put Bruce Rauner into power to begin with. That is why I originally ran for office back in 2012. It's why I'm running for Attorney General now. It's why I've stood up to the machine time and time again, because it is not doing the people of Illinois, it is not doing the people of the United States any good. To be progressive, we need to have progress, and part of progress is looking at ourselves and making sure we make the changes we need to make to be the strongest party we can be.
Thank you. We have a couple more questions, and for each of these questions, there'll only be 4 respondents to these particular topics. So this first question is related to environmental policy for the state of Illinois, and the respondents for that question will be Mr. Quinn, Mrs. Rodering, Mr. Jury, and Mrs. Fairley. And the question is, the Attorney General has power and authority to protect public health and the environment by pursuing enforcement actions that state agencies have not yet identified. What are 2 potential environmental issues or environmental crimes that you believe should be pursued by the Illinois Attorney General?
Well, the Illinois Constitution gives the Attorney General the right to bring lawsuits against polluters, particularly in the area of Commonwealth Edison, and their nuclear power plants. Exelon is part of that as well. Also, clean water issues regarding Lake Michigan. As governor, I was chairman of the Great Lakes Commission. We can't have happen in Illinois what happened in Flint, Michigan. We've got to make sure the Attorney General prosecutes any violations of clean water. It occurred in Crestwood when I was governor, and the Attorney General stepped in and worked with our office to deal with their tainted water. So I think this is a very important issue. Our Constitution, unlike many other states, has an express right of healthful environment. Every person is entitled to that fundamental right, and it's the duty of every person to provide and maintain a healthful environment for this and future generations. Those are the exact words in our Constitution. The Attorney General is the key person, especially now that Trump is in office, and put a person in Region 5 here of the Environmental Protection Agency that is not committed to clean air, clean water, clean land. It's very, very important that our Attorney General, more than ever, prosecute violations, whether they're radioactive leaks from nuclear power plants or polluted water or anything else.
Thank you. Mrs. Rodering.
So I cut my political teeth on environmental activism, and as a volunteer created an environmental advocacy program for public school kids in my town. Over 5,000 kids learned 10 different curricular tracks of potential environmental activism. This one is near and dear to my heart. Land, water, air. It is incumbent upon the Attorney General to be the defendant, the protector, and ensure that all of our people have the health and safety that they deserve, and goes after those polluters. You asked 2 areas. I'll talk first about lead and water. One of the things I did when we heard about Flint, Michigan, was immediately demand that every government in my town test the water that was available to children and to the public. Everybody balked. They said it was going to be costly. I told them it was non-negotiable. There were issues. They got cleaned up. They said, we're good. I said, no, next year we're going to do this again and again and again. And more things have been found and more things have been cleaned up. Let's talk about air. There's an issue not only in Chicago but in Waukegan. 1 out of every 3 kids has asthma. The national average is 1 out of 10. We need to hold polluters accountable because kids unfortunately don't have voices. And as your Attorney General, I will stand up not only for the kids of Illinois, but the people of Illinois, in making sure that our land and our air and our water are safe for all of us.
Thank you. Mr. Jury.
I'm proud to have a 100% voting record with the Illinois Environmental Council, which is a council that pushes environmental legislation and watches over the General Assembly in the state of Illinois. 2 issues that need to be addressed. One are the coal plants, and it's not just enough to say that people have asthma from coal plants. It's what are you going to do about it? It is a civil rights issue, and civil rights litigation needs to be brought by the Illinois Attorney General to make sure that people who live in disadvantaged areas can get rid of those coal plants, because you know what? They're not on the north side of the city, they're not on the North Shore, they're in the poorest areas of the city of Illinois, and they are harming our children. Every child has a right to grow up and breathe fresh air. Another issue we need to look at is our landfills. Our landfills are polluted. There's landfills on Lake Michigan in my community, and that landfill is leaching toxic chemicals into Lake Michigan. When I first got into office, I tried to deal with the EPA under Governor Quinn and had to do my own FOIA, Freedom of Information Act request, to get information about toxic chemicals. That needs to end, and as the Attorney General, I'm going to make sure that we are holding ComEd, we are holding Exelon accountable.
Thank you. Mrs. Fairley.
Protecting our clear air and water is just an incredibly essential aspect of the responsibility of the office. And so I would look to do a couple of things. The first thing is to make sure that we're working towards renewable energy, but in a way that is safe and that is fair in terms of the cost to us as the ratepayers. I was concerned about the most recent legislation that was actually enacted over the objection of Attorney General Lisa Madigan, because it was way too favorable to Exelon, the companies that has contributed to a couple of the candidates here today. The second thing I will do is look to expand the enforcement power of the office by encouraging the state's attorneys across the state to rebuild their criminal groups that focus on environmental crimes. Right now, I don't think that there's one state's attorney's office that has an environmental crime unit, because they haven't been putting resources in that area, and I think that we need to encourage them to do that. So those are just two of the things that I would be working on. Thanks.
Thank you. This next question is related to privatization. It will be directed toward Mr. Goldstein, Mr. Ruiz, Mr. Mariotti, and Mr. Raul. So the question is, do you believe there should be more oversight of privatization deals? Should that oversight come from the Illinois Attorney General or from some other part of Illinois government? Mr. Goldstein. Yes.
This is probably one question I can answer in less than a minute. No privatization. Let's stop privatization first and foremost. Let's stop privatizing our schools. Let's stop privatizing our roads. Let's stop privatizing the commons, okay? And, you know, what do we have? We have charter schools. That's the privatization of schools. We need to stop that. And the Attorney General needs to look into that. Why? Because there's corruption there. When 50 schools are closed, and then just a few more got closed just recently, and now we're opening charter schools, that's corruption. Call it what it is. You know, we talk about corruption a whole lot, but we sort of have a very limited view of what corruption is. The more we privatize, the more corruption happens. So the Attorney General, as Attorney General, that'll be part of the Public Integrity Bureau, that'll be part of the fight against corruption to go after this privatization. Basically, it's a trend that needs to stop.
Thank you. Mr. Ruiz.
Just to point out that charter schools are public schools, and those are granted by state law. And no, in fact, that is the truth. And so you'll have to get the law changed in order to change that trend. And so some of these trends exist. But what do you do, the question was, what do you do about these things? And you're not going to turn every single local unit of government that has home rule authority. That's just not realistic. So you have to be discerning in what folks are telling you here. And the truth of the matter is, you can't do that as Attorney General. What you can do is make sure that the Freedom of Information Act is fully enforced. You make sure that and which is why I'm calling for it at Chicago Public Schools, that make sure every single source and sole source contract is fully vetted in public view, that Sunshine truly does go through, and so make sure that you have a conflict of interest policy to make sure that where anybody who has a relationship with a legislator or anybody who has any interest in voting on that contract is fully vetted and out there in public. And so those are the things you do as Attorney General, and if there is any corruption, you see it, then you file suit and pursue those folks. But these are the realistic things that you can do. You cannot stop every single unit of government or every school district in the state from operating the way it chooses to operate. But you can oversee it.
Thank you. Mr. Mariotti.
when politicians want to take things that are public and sign some deal with a company, usually you can count on the fact that there's something involved in it for them. I will tell you, we've seen this in Chicago with our completely disastrous parking meters scandal, right? Where literally we had billions of dollars of future revenue that were given away by politicians. I agree that we've seen that with our schools. I have to disagree with the point that was just made on that. I think that we constantly, what we're seeing here is, I talked about it before, people, we talk about corruption as if it's just this narrow, are you following the laws? I mean, in this race, I'll tell you, there was talk about campaign finance. There are unlimited campaign contributions in this race. A millionaire could give $1 million or $2 million or $10 million to one of the candidates on the stage, and that would not violate the law. Isn't that ridiculous? I mean, the laws in this state at times are ridiculous. And so what we need to do is stop saying, oh, well, it's about following the law. We need to do more than that. And that's the case with privatization. We need to have the Attorney General's office investigating and issuing reports about about privatization, whether it follows the law or not, so the people know what their politicians in Springfield are up to.
Thank you. Mr. Raoul.
We should absolutely stop this trend of privatizing public functions, because once you shift to privatizing public functions, it's not about the service you provide, it's about making a buck. It's about squeezing out the dollar. And it shouldn't happen with education. That should be about educating kids. I was proud to vote for a proactive bill to make sure that we can't privatize prisons in the state of Illinois. We've seen what has happened nationally with the privatization of prisons. You have people that are incented to keep people there longer. They're making products. Free labor, that's slavery. We need to stop this trend. The trend also results in cronyism, rewarding friends with contracts. It needs to stop.
Thank you. So we've come down to our final question, and this question will be for all 8 of the candidates. This question is on a very important issue that has touched many, many lives, many in this room, and it's the issue of gun violence. It is not just an issue for those who live in the city of Chicago or in Cook County. It is an issue across the state of Illinois. So this question, we will go in order, starting with Mr. Quinn and continuing on with each person after that. So the question on gun violence, in your view, what are the biggest impediments to reducing gun violence in the state of Illinois? What do you see also as the most promising ways to reduce gun violence in the state of Illinois? Mr. Quinn.
Well, I believe we need to pass more laws dealing with this issue on gun safety. I signed laws when I was governor dealing with lost and stolen guns, and also with stronger oversight of the transfer of guns. I think, though, to get really strong laws dealing with high-capacity ammunition magazines, I brought in the Newtown parents. They stayed at the governor's mansion. We tried to pass that through the Senate, failed by 2 votes. And I think the way to get reform that the people want, the people of Illinois want, is put it on the ballot as a binding referendum. The people are for this. They're for limiting high-capacity ammunition magazines and assault weapons. We had a referendum that I got on the ballot in 2014 that was advisory in Cook County. It got nearly 90% of the vote, but the legislators won't pay attention. Now, when I was governor, there was a concealed carry bill that passed the General Assembly. I thought it was defective, and I mandatory vetoed it, and I put in a lot of safeguards, making sure that local communities had the right to ban assault weapons, to deal with these high-capacity ammunition magazines, to tighten up oversight with respect to transfer of weapons. All those things were rejected, unfortunately, by the Senate and by the House, and I think that was wrong. I don't think they reflected the majority of the people of Illinois. So the Attorney General has to band together with the people to get these important safeguards, gun safety standards established in our law, and I think that we can do it if we band together and work together in the best traditions of democracy.
Thank you. Mr. Ruiz.
We do have a problem with illegal guns entering our city and our state. from Indiana, from Wisconsin, where it's just too easy. Now in Wisconsin, a baby could buy a gun. I mean, we're surrounded by ridiculous laws in other states that then inflict damage on us. I mean, I started a Little League team when I came back from U of I in the Roseland community so I could keep young boys safe. But two of them, Jorge Jaramillo and Raul Hurtado, unfortunately, were shot dead when they became a few years older. And so it's personal that I've seen way too many kids I knew and neighbors that I knew in my Roseland neighborhood be killed by illegal guns that are just over the Indiana border, not far on the southeast side of Chicago. And so we need to license gun shops like Chuck's in Dalton, Illinois, that sells so many guns to so many straw purchasers, and make sure we can regulate these folks to make sure who are putting harmful products in our communities and making sure those products aren't used for illegal purposes and unfortunately taking too many young lives way too prematurely.
Thank you. Mrs. Rodering.
So the question was, what's the obstacle to dealing with gun violence in the state of Illinois? And I have to tell you, unfortunately, it's a lack of courage on the part of our legislature. You have folks on this stage who are telling you that they've tried to promote, and they will tell you that they promoted strong gun legislation, but in fact, in our city, we had a 10-day window to ban assault weapons and large capacity magazines, and we did it. But the vast majority of cities in this state don't have that opportunity anymore because the law that these folks passed has passed. That window is shut. And so while it's constitutional to ban large capacity magazines and assault weapons in Illinois, nobody in this state has that opportunity anymore. I wrote letters to the Illinois General Assembly a few weeks ago asking them to reopen that question. Nobody responded. I've now been in touch with my state senator. She is reintroducing that legislation in a few weeks. When members of the Illinois General Assembly had the opportunity to deal with folks like Chuck's and pass registration requirements for gun dealers, a number of them chose not to take that question before petitions were filed. They didn't want to get primaried. They were more concerned about saving their jobs than saving lives. So if you want to ask yourselves why there's an obstacle, it's a lack of courage on the behalf of the Illinois General Assembly. Your Attorney General needs to be the person who promotes that movement, needs to be that advocate. I've done that in Highland Park. I will do that in the state of Illinois.
Thank you. Mr. Raul.
I guess I've been to see the wizard because I have courage. That's what allowed me to make sure we have universal background checks here in Illinois, to make sure that we have background checks on the private transfer of guns. That's what allowed me to make sure that we have reporting of lost and stolen weapons. That's what allowed me to pass out of the Senate gun dealer licensing along with Senator Harman. However, I can talk about legislation on and on and on. A shooter does not come out of the womb with a gun in his or her hand. We have to deal with the conditions in these communities. We have to shift resources to these communities. We can't be closing down their schools. We can't be not investing in the communities, not providing jobs in the communities, and expecting people who have guns trafficked into their communities and not given any alternatives in life to not be swayed by the negative influences in their communities. We can focus on laws till the end of time, but until we start shifting resources to these disadvantaged communities, people will break the law. You can pass all sorts of laws. People will break the law. To shoot somebody is a violation of the law. But you have to be providing alternatives to people because, again, they are not coming out of the womb a shooter.
Thank you. Mr. Mariotti.
Well, I think the original question is what you can do to best stop gun violence, and it's really to end economic inequality and racism in communities in this city that are, frankly, there are people in this city that are facing a lot of despair and don't have a lot of alternatives, and that is definitely part of the problem. That said, I don't believe the sort of guns don't shoot people shoot people thing either. I do think there are gun laws that we can, and there are methods, and frankly, we have not been aggressive enough in combating gun trafficking from out of state. But when it comes down to it, what would really make the biggest difference is investment in communities, and more importantly, it is focusing on violent crime, not on nonviolent crime. What creates people who have despair and violence in our society is people who are in a prison system where they go in and out of prison. They spend so much time in prison, it ends up impacting an entire family. If you have somebody in prison, what ends up happening is they lose a paycheck, it hurts everyone in the family, and that ultimately turns people to violence.
Thank you. Mr. Goldstein.
So the issue of gun violence and violence in general is systemic, and it takes hours and hours of discussion to get to the roots of income inequality and lack of opportunity and lack of jobs and institutional racism that goes centuries. So obviously there's no one way to fix this problem. But as Attorney General, this is what I propose and this is what I will do. Sue the gun manufacturers. You pay attention to this case in Newtown, Connecticut, that terrible tragedy that happened in Sandy Hook. The parents are suing the gun manufacturer that made that rifle. And they lost, it was dismissed, but it's before the Supreme Court of Connecticut. There are opportunities, even though there's immunity, which boggles my mind that there's federal immunity for gun manufacturers, there are loopholes. And as Attorney General, I'm going to find those loopholes, go after the gun manufacturers.
This is really a complex problem that doesn't have just one solution. It really has to be surrounded from a number of vantage points. So the first thing is to change gun laws. The second thing is to make sure that we have tough enforcement. And then the third thing is to implement community programs to support the community and address these economic disparity issues that we have. So let me just talk about those. We need to fight for the gun dealer licensing statute. We need to push that through and get it done. We need to push through the bump stock legislation and get that done. We need to ban assault weapons. We need to get those things done. We need to improve our enforcement to make sure that when void cards are revoked, that those guns are not in the hands of those people, particularly when you have people who are involved in domestic violence incidents. We need to then put in place community programs, educational programs, trauma-informed care programs, re-entry programs, several community-based programs to address the underlying causes of the violence. So there's just not one thing. It has to be surrounded from a number of different points of view, and that's the approach that I'll take as Attorney General.
I'm glad that a number of the solutions that have been proposed are solutions that I've been directly involved in. So the issue of allowing local communities to have assault weapons bans. It was in my community where I got all the mayors of my community together and said, hey, you got 10 days to do this. And it was my small town of Highwood that went first and had the courage to say, we're going to enact this, followed by Highland Park, followed by North Chicago, followed by Deerfield. And we now have the district with the most communities in it that have banned assault weapons, and I'm proud of that. When it comes to bump stocks, it was my legislation that we introduced in a Democratic General Assembly to ban all trigger modification devices that were used in the Las Vegas massacre, and we could not get more than 32 Democrats out of 67 to vote for that. 32. A lot of them did not even vote. So how do you change things? You hold people to their responsibilities and you hold them accountable. The answer to stopping gun violence is not what the General Assembly did this year, which was to increase mandatory minimum sentences for people that likely will impact people in minority communities. It's the absolutely wrong thing to do. We need to invest in community and education. We need to invest in after-school programs. We need to show people that we care about the communities, because the cause of gun violence is not necessarily guns. It's a societal issue that we have been ignoring in this state and in this country for decades. And if you want someone who's serious about it, again, you look to what they've done in the past. And I'm proud of the record that I've built standing up to the NRA and pushing solutions to the gun violence problem that I first started working on when I was at the U.S. Attorney's Office.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, if we can give a round of applause for the candidates.